Hello, it's Maggie the Cheshire Crafter here. Now I've been making a patchwork quilt for my friend's birthday and it's turned into a square piece of patchwork and I want to make it into a lap size blanket. So in this little video I want to look at some ideas of how to elongate a quilt by adding additional borders that look like they have a purpose and a reason for being there. Using this method, I added an additional 10 inches to the length. Come into the kitchen with me and I'll show you how I did it and give you some ideas of how you might be able to elongate your quilts. So in this little short video, I just want to show you ways to elongate a square patchwork quilt. First, I've ironed the piece of patchwork. But all I've done so far is make a square quilt bigger. It's still a square. Now, I made the patchwork with jelly rolls, so I'm limited in how much spare fabric I had. I'm going to talk you through the choices now I've got. In order to elongate it, I'm going to add another header and footer. I cut the borders at 3 inches wide so that by the time the seam allowance is taken up, there'll be 2.5 inches. And I took that into account in looking at the size of the header and the footer, and I doubled the size. So my finished border is going to be 2.5 inches, and my header and footer are going to be 5 inches. And in order to do that, I had to cut the fabric at 5.5 inches with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I've chosen to use the same white cotton. Chosen to use this floral fabric for my outside trim, and I've already cut that at 2.5 inch strips. My outer border is going to be this gorgeous yellow, which is going to match here. And I've got the patchwork strips that I had from this project and a previous one. I could put them together and sew a scrappy border if I liked, but I don't like for this one. It's just an option. Use what you've got. It's better at this point to tie something in to the overall look of the quilt than it is to introduce a different fabric. But there are no rules. Do what you like. So from my scrappy pieces, I could add in another border and I'd probably get another 4 inch border out of that. I'm going to show you what to avoid here though. I'm adding from 2 pieces of scrap from a previous quilt I've done. So the scrap that matches this patchwork would look fine. Even adding a few oddments is fine. And actually, it looks really nice. What I want to avoid, though, is having too many seams too close together. Can you imagine trying to do a 1/2 inch... Sorry, can you imagine trying to do a 1/4 inch seam there? You've got too many seams all together. And whichever way around I put it, it's not going to look right. And I haven't got enough fabric to do the top and the bottom this way, so I opted against that for this quilt. But actually this is a really good idea to elongate but match something in to your quilt. I'll use these pieces in a different way, perhaps to make a matching cushion. That'd be a great idea, wouldn't it? If I had more jelly roll strips, which I don't, another option is to put another layer, but just do a horizontal strip right the way across with each of the 5 pieces of fabric, or even leaving that one out and using 4 pieces of floral fabric together to make a horizontal strip across at the top and the bottom. I could go rogue and add a plain white border and add pieces of fabric just in a very ad hoc applique way. Or I could separate them out and throw them on and get a really random look and have a confetti look That'd be lovely, but I've not opted for that. Let me show you what I've opted to do. With my 5-inch border, I'm going to have to add another piece on, so I really don't want the seam coming near this, but neither do I want the seam to be in the centre of the quilt, which is here. And I'm going to applique onto that something that's appropriate. This is from a best friend. So from the fabric which matches the patchwork, I've cut out 5 applique hearts, and I'm going to sew these on with a bit of wonder web and then stitch around the edge of them by hand with a blanket stitch. And I'm going to make sure that I line them up so they come, first of all, the middle one will come to line up with the middle of the quilt, and then I'll put them equidistant towards the end of the patchwork. So I'm not going to end up with the last one right in the border here. It's going to be somewhere like here, but I'm going to measure it. Actually, that looks pretty good, doesn't it? So if my quilt, say, was there, I'm going to put that one around about there and in a little bit. I'm going to go by eye to see what looks best, but that then is going to be my header. I'm going to do those, stitch those on before I add that border, because it's going to be easier for me to do by hand while I'm watching the telly without all this on my lap. Now for my footer, let me show you what I've decided to do. For my footer, I'm going to use this quality cotton lace. It's very pretty. I haven't yet sewed my cotton footer together, but I'm going to show you that when I sew this on, I'm going to sew the lace on so that I make sure it comes right to the edge and is secured in the seam before I cut that lace off. And I'm going to sew that on first, and I've opted to sew it midway between, I'm going to have to measure, but I want it midway on that border width. And then I've recycled these buttons from another project, and I'm going to add 9 buttons across that. And when I line them up, I want to make sure that if this is at the top of the quilt midway, I want the buttons to look equidistant, for example. They're going to be quite a distance away from them, but I want to look like there's a purpose for the placement of them. So when I come to the edge here, I would want the button there. As I've got 5 of these, I'm going to place 5 buttons like that, and then I'm going to place a button midway between. Now when I'm putting embellishments on, I'm adding them in odd numbers. This quilt is very geometric and very square already. I want to soften this a little bit, and the way to do that is with an odd number rather than an even number. So let me do all of that, and then I'll show you what that looks like when I've completed it. You could use anything for embellishment here. Buttons, rickrack, satin ribbon, lace, whatever you fancy. Or it's appropriate for the person, and make sure that it's in line with your theme. If you see in this pattern here, there is brown in here, and it goes along with my original, the brown picks out my original inspiration. A wider border makes it more difficult to see the hemline tape, so I find I mark across the diagonal with either a lead pencil or an erasable ink pen. That way it leaves a line that gives me a guide for sewing. I'm going to sew directly on that line now. For the placement of the lace, I need to find the middle point of the fabric. So I've folded the fabric in half lengthways, and I've just ironed it so that I've got a crease. I'll start placing my lace there, and I want the middle of the lace to sit over that crease and pin it in place, and do that to the other end. Sewing it onto the front of this border, so my seam is underneath, and you'll notice that my seam is at the opposite side to the seam in the inner border, so it just doesn't meet and make a full line, makes it a bit less obvious. And I'm trying not to stretch this lace, because when it's washed, I don't want this cotton lace to shrink at a different rate to the cotton of the fabric. And I'm going to secure it in 2 lines of sewing at the top and at the bottom. I'll do that by hand while I'm watching the television. I'm only doing it to the edge of the inner border. I'm not going to take this design into the outer border, so it will finish flush with this edge. Hearts, I've used a ruler, but I've lined up this middle one with the centerpiece. There is no way of avoiding going over that seam, but I've taken the outer hearts in equidistant, and then I've measured the distance between, and then when you stand back, just make sure that they look placed correctly. Now I'm going to attach them with a tiny bit of wonder web just to hold them in place, and then unpin them. This is just leftover wonder web from other piecing, tiny piece, and I'm just pressing it down with the iron just to hold that in place before I pin it so it doesn't move, but it's not enough to secure it all the way around, and it won't feel like it's stiff and glued underneath. I'll sew the lace on with a white thread, but I've chosen for this from my Silco gallery a 40 weight thread, and the colour is light cornflower. It's a beautiful blue that'll show up and shine against that heart fabric. For the buttons, I've chosen this Silco. It's the same weight of thread. This one is called Harvest. These are from my vintage collection of threads. Then I'll stitch the borders on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Thanks for watching. I hope that's given you some ideas. Please like and subscribe, so come back to me to view the whole video where I show how I make the whole quilt. I'll be uploading that soon. I need to get this in the post next week for my friend's August birthday. So for now, this is Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter. Bye. See you soon.